Hello everyone. Today we will be discussing another topic entitled Selection and Gradation in Materials Development. So again, this is Mom Pearl and welcome back to my YouTube channel. For today's goals or learning objectives, first, uphold the importance of needs analysis in mounting materials through proper selection and gradation in materials development. Next, appraise the content of language learning materials development, textbooks and resources based on the knowledge of relevant content in the study of the adoption of various texts. Third, adopt or create materials that can serve as resources for effective teaching and learning. And for the last, share insights, feedbacks, and reactions about the importance of language learning materials development. So before we start, let's have first this quotation from Paul Helms. The best way to learn is to do, and the worst way to teach is to talk. Wherein, again, this is very true because without letting the students to explore, okay, regarding the subject matter or the target language, for example, or in doing or creating materials, for example, they cannot really learn about it. Okay, and in our part, if we are going to teach or train someone, it's better that let them explore. Okay, if we are still the one who work it for them, then there will be no learning. So we have here the student-centered approach answers for questions. So the first one, content. So what knowledge and skills will be studied? Process, what materials and procedures will be used? For the product, what will students produce to demonstrate their learning? And of course, for the evaluation, how will the learning be assessed? And going to instructional materials development, well, instruction, it is a deliberately arranged set of external events that are designed to support internal learning process. While instructional materials, these are printed or other media intended to convey events of instruction. And instructional media, so this is typical means which instructional message is communicated. We also have the traditional instructional media. So what are those? We have chalkboard or blackboard, whiteboard, flannel board, flip chart, a periscope, real objects or displacement, models, and simulators. How about the modern instructional media? So we have a digital presenter, a visualizer, smartboard, modern whiteboard, 3D printed models, simulator, augmented reality, and we have the virtual reality. For instructional design theories, so when we say instruction, it is a planned process that facilitates learning. And instructional design, this is the process of using our knowledge of how pupils or students learn to develop effective instructional strategies that meet the needs of the learners and the desired learning outcomes. So there are 5 steps. The first one is assess the situation or the need assessment. Second, state the goal objectives. Third, select appropriate medium or media. Okay, so the media that we are going to use or integrate. Fourth is implementation. And the last one, evaluation and revision. We also have the attributes and selections of instructional materials. So by definition, it is a physical means by which an instructional message is communicated, like printed text, audio with tape, instructor talking, and etc. So we have the elements, advantages, and disadvantages as a basis of selection to learning objectives, instructional method, learner characteristics, teacher characteristics, course characteristics, media characteristics, and of course the practical issues. Now, let's have the steps in the implementation. So of course, we have the first one, review instructional goals, objectives, audience, and the strategy. So this is of course the most important because they will be the one that we are going to cater to based on the instructional materials or learning materials that we are going to create or develop. Second, determine the best suitable medium. Third, search for and review existing media or materials. Fourth, adopt existing media materials if necessary. Fifth, if new media materials need to be developed, so it could be you're going to determine format, script, visuals, etc. Draft materials and media. So you are also going to check for clarity and flow of ideas. Now let's have the conduct formative evaluation. Okay, the assessment, implement or apply, and then evaluate and revise. Next, basic principles of preparing instructional materials. So the fundamental criteria for effectiveness of teaching or learning material from audio to visual aids are audibility and visibility. So we have the classification like purely auditory, purely visual, require projection, doesn't require projection, audio visual, computer mediated materials. And going to basic principles, we have the relevance, linkage, simplicity, emphasis, consistency, and pattern. No, the about its characteristics, so we have to include all necessary information, leave out unnecessary information, have information in the right order, describe all situations in decision making, and avoid instructions or avoid vague or unclear instructions. There are also its advantages and disadvantages. And talking to its importance, of course, the first one is aid seeking process, aid learning process, exposed to virtual object, conceptualization, bridges the experimental gap, achievement of instructional goals. So we have the factors affecting media selection. The first one is students, objective, environment, resources, practicality, or practicability. Of course, we have to consider these factors upon choosing the instructional materials, especially the medium, okay, or medium that we are going to use. Now, preparing effective handout. So an instructional tool that complements a teaching session resulting in improved understanding of information and test performance. For its purpose, as a class outline or lesson summary, as a guide to the student through a lecture, to relieve students of taking notes, to prepare students from a discussion, guide the students for further reading, and of course supply additional information not readily available elsewhere. Now let's proceed to language-centered and learner-centered perspective. So among the major initials of any language program is the specification of content of language teaching and learning developing materials, as the aim of content specification is to prepare the list of items in the order they will be taught. So different factors like the environment in which the course will be used, needs of the learners, and teaching and learning principles should be taken into account as according to Nation and McAllister 2010. Therefore, the process of content specification maximizes the interaction between the input or content, learner, and learning process. And in curriculum development, once the input is determined, issues concerning the content and design of classroom activities and materials should be addressed as according to Kumaral Vadi Volume 2006. And based on the principles of language teaching and learning, so the content of a language lesson may be mainly focused on language functions, topics and themes, genre, skills and sub-skills, situations and rules, strategies, or task outcomes, which are called units of progression. In a language-centered curriculum, in the area of grammar, choices have to be made regarding the units of vocabulary, grammar verb forms, verb patterns, sentence patterns, or language functions. And in a learner-centered curriculum, in the area of tasks, the most appropriate pedagogy tasks are determined through needs analysis, of course. The tasks provide language samples to learners and allow negotiation of difficulty as according to Nation and McAllister 2010 still. And therefore, depending on the goal of a language lesson, certain units of regression might be used to select and sequence the materials in the course. Moreover, due to the limited amount of time in teaching language, a major problem to be solved in specifying what units of progression should be selected from the total list of units of analysis. Once the units are specified, other problems to be solved include gradation and sequencing. So that was according to Stern, 1983. Hence, making reasonable decisions about the content compliant with the teaching and learning principles, whether through a language-centered and learner-centered approach, is a crucial element in materials development. Now, regarding the content specification in language-centered syllabuses. So, the content specification in language-centered syllabuses has been one of the most fluctuating and controversial areas of second language pedagogy. In making decisions about the content in developing materials, a variety of perspectives in the triple principles of selection, gradation and sequencing of language should be considered, as also according to Komarov-Valdivel 2006. And talking with the materials development in language-centered syllabuses, it demands the choice of what to be included from the total field of the subject through the selection of certain features of the language and the intentional or unintentional exclusion of others as according to White, 1988. And selecting content, therefore, primarily focuses on grammatical structures, notional functional categories, situational and topics. Still is according to Komarov-Valdivel 2006, Jan Dunan 2001, and of course, Pekin 1985. And a major factor in content selections, which also differentiates language-centered syllabuses from learner-centered types, is the degree to which they call for the analysis of the language before it is presented to the learner. In language-centered syllabuses, the selection of content depends on syllabus designers' priorities, experiences, and belief about the nature of language and learning, as according to Noonan, 1988, which is in line with Breen's on the year 1984 idea that judgments in the selection of materials are value-laden. Therefore, in a language-centered syllabus, like a structural syllabus, is steered by realistic philosophy and curriculum development, the content and what of language teaching is determined in advance. And realistic philosophy spotlights the precise, measurably stated objectives to be written prior to instruction, which specify the content of the teaching. Hence, materials developers in language-centered syllabuses attempt to pre-specify the content based on the general question of what linguistic elements do learners need to master. as according to Newton on the year 1988, where in fact they tend to give more importance to the artful selection and organization of structures, according to White on the year 1988, through focusing on grammatical, phonological, and vocabulary items, which should be mastered by the learners, still from Newton. Since language is so complex and it is not possible to teach the whole language, one of the foremost problems in developing materials is to decide about the components that should be selected from the total corpus of language and introduced into textbooks and other teaching materials. Among language components, vocabulary and grammar were two aspects that received primary attention, and their selection laid the foundations for developing materials in language-centered curriculums in the first few decades of the 20th century, as according to Richards on the year 2001. Now, talking with the vocabulary selection, discussing the question of vocabulary selection, as according to Wilkins 1976, claimed that the attention of methodologists was first directed to vocabulary because the actual day-to-day use of language includes words that are different from the somewhat literary and arbitrary vocabulary that learners encounter in their reading-based courses. And with that, to ensure that the vocabulary content is the most useful and relevant one to learners' needs, of course, different criteria have been used. For example, Wilkins referred to frequency, range availability, familiarity, and coverage availability, or coverage and range availability, learnability and teachability. So for Richards 2001, the criteria used in determining word list include teachability, similarity, availability, coverage, and defining power. Frequency as a major criterion used for vocabulary selection refers to the total number of occurrences of an item in a corpus of language. Since coverage refers to the number of meanings that a given item expresses. And in selecting the vocabulary content, if two possible words have the same frequency, the item which covers the greatest number of uses is preferable to be included. Because range, as another criterion in vocabulary selection, refers to the applicability of an item in different contexts. And to ensure that the frequency of words in the corpus is related to learners' needs, the language text which form the basis for the corpus must be relevant to the needs of learners and must be frequent in a wide range of different language samples. This is referred so far to as words range or dispersion from Richards 2001, and another criterion of selection is availability. Some words are not frequent but are readily available in the mind when certain topics are taught of. For example, the word classrooms calls the mind or calls to the mind the other items like desk, chair, teacher, and students. Richards referred to defining power as another criterion in the selection of vocabulary. So words with high defining power are useful in defining other words despite the fact that they might not be among the most frequent words. For example, the word container has a high defining power because it can help in defining bucket, jar, and carton. And talking about learnability, it can be applied to both selection and gradation of vocabulary content, as according to Mackey on the year 1967, and highlights the consideration of 5 factors. The first factor refers to the similarity of the second language words to its first language equivalent, such as the Persian, meaning the word taxi in Persian and in English, taxi. Okay, so look for the spelling. The second factor is demonstrability of a word, which contributes to its teachability. A concrete word like car is easier to understand and teach than an abstract noun like transport. The third factor is brevity, which is based on the assumptions that long words are more difficult to learn than short ones. And with that, the word car is easier than the term automobile. And that is true. The fourth factor is regularity of form, that is, a verb with a regular past tense, which will be easier to learn than irregular verbs. The learning load that a new word represents is the final factor. Knowing one or more components of an item reduces the learning load. For example, the word handbag is easy to learn when both elements of the word are already known separately. Another, learnability can be applied to both selection and gradation of vocabulary content, as according to Mackey on the year 1967, and highlight the consideration of 5 factors. So what are these 5 factors? The first factor refers to the similarity of the second language word to its first language equivalent, such as the Persian, which is taxi, and English taxi. The second factor is demonstrability of a word, which contributes to its teachability. A concrete word like a car is easier to understand and teach than an abstract noun like transport. And the third factor is brevity, which is based on the assumption that long words are more difficult to learn than short ones. Therefore, the word car is easier than the term automobile. And lastly, the fourth factor is regularity of a form, that is a verb with a regular past tense, which will be easier to learn than irregular verbs. The learning load that a new word represents is the final factor. Knowing one or more components of an item reduces the learning load. For example, the word handbag is easy to learn when both elements of the words are already known separately. For grammar selection, the grammar selection is subject to the same criteria as the ones mentioned for the selection of vocabulary. However, frequency, range, and availability might not be used as a basis for structured selection. Concerning the selection of grammar, according to White on the year 1988, it refers to teachability and learnability that motivate the selection of sentence patterns based on the learnability criteria. Simple grammatical structures are easier to learn than the more complex ones. As Richards 2001 believed, that grammatical syllabuses were developed from different principles based on intuitive criteria of simplicity, centrality, and learnability. According to simplicity centrality principle, structures that are simple and more central to the basic structure of the language should be selected rather than the complex and peripheral structures in the introductory levels. The second criterion, which is the learnability, highlights The significance of considering the order in which grammatical items are acquired in second language learning, and in many courses grammar is used as the major unit of progression. However, the problem materials developers face is how to grade and organize the language elements. And for gradation, so it is concerned with the grouping and sequencing of teaching items in a syllabus, as according to Richards on the year 2001. So according to him, gradation and grading are terms used to refer to the ordering of the language for teaching purposes. Gradation answers the questions what goes with what comes before what. And in organizing the language content according to Allen 1984, cited in White 1988, some form of grading is necessary. And syllabus specification has long been based on gradation in terms of syntactic complexity. It is assumed that there is an inverse relationship between the linguistic complexity of a structure and its learnability. Thus, syllabuses should present structures from simple to difficult. But what makes structures difficult, according to Hall 1989, believes that difficulty is a seemingly common sense concept behind which lies the problem of discovering what materials is difficult of learners. So some structures are more difficult than others, and that easy structures should come before the difficult ones are evident. However, discovering the linguistic characteristics that make structures difficult or easy is crucial. Regarding the decisions on what makes structures difficult or simple in target language are based on linguistic analysis of the target grammar. For example, the structures which require fewer transformational operations for their realization and grammatical forms which have one or two functions should be presented earlier than those which require more transformational operations or than the ones that have a less clear relationship between form and functions, according to Peak on the year 1985. In a traditional definition of difficulty, Larson 1984 states that difficulty depends upon the degree and the type of difference between the first language, or the L1, and the second language, which is L2, and sequencing should be designed accordingly. Those structures that are similar to L1 should be taught first. This approach is based on a contrastive analysis of the learner's L1 and the target language, as according to Alice on the year 2006. However, it is worth mentioning that systematic principles of gradation were first established by some figures such as Comenius in Europe by the end of Renaissance. He believed that knowledge must necessarily come in successive steps and proficiency can be obtained by degrees. Systematic gradation could reduce difficulties when materials were arranged in steps and progressed gradually. This means only that uniformity or uniformity, like teaching related things together, and parallelism, like arranging few before many, simple before complex. This can lead to rapidity and make for greater clarity, as according to Mackey on the year 1967. No, concerning gradation in language-centered syllabuses, as according to Richards on the year 2001, who proposed four approaches. First, linguistic distance structures that are similar to those in the native language should be taught first. Second, intrinsic difficulty, like simple structures, should be taught before complex ones. The third one, communicative need, some structures are needed early and cannot be postponed despite their difficulty. And lastly, frequency. The other of or the order, what I mean, the order of presentation of structures can be influenced by their frequency of occurrence. And White on the year 1988 says that there are different considerations in grading, including combinability, groupings, and contrast, which are based on linguistic considerations. In addition, Richard 2001 states that in gradation, we are concerned with the groupings and sequencing of teaching items in a syllabus. This means the set of items and their order of teaching should be specified. In fact, we can consider both the system and structure for materials since the materials is language made up of a system of sounds, words, phrases, and meanings which can be fitted into structures and arranged in various types of sequences. So in grouping and sequencing, we deal with the questions specified in Table 1. So this is among various criteria to consider in grading materials as according to Elizabeth and Rao 2004 proposed two basic principles of grouping and sequencing. So here it is. First, sounds like but, say, sought, etc. Example is phonetic grouping. Second, words used in the same situation, like words connected with the post office, postman, letters, etc. So that comprise for lexical grouping. The third one, patterns of sentences which are similar and should be taught together. For example, this dot is my book, your book, etc. So that falls in grammatical grouping. Fourth, words that convey similar meanings should be grouped together, like shelter, hat, house, tent, etc. So that will be on semantic grouping. And lastly, selected items that fit together, like sounds into words, words into phrases, phrases into sentences, and sentences into context, like structure grouping. The second principle is sequence, which is about what comes after what. Like sequencing is in a system can be in accordance with first lexical sequence, which words follow, which for example, sit, stand, come, go. Second, grammatical sequence, which structure follows which. Third, semantic sequence, every word has a number of meanings. They are put in order and are taught in different occasions. For example, the word there, or the pen is their place, and letter A, the pen is their place, and letter B, there are many pens. Introduction. Thus, sequencing the units of progression is in a course is another issue to be considered in developing materials, which is discussed below. Again, sequencing, all methods arrange their materials in sequences because any item must necessarily precede or follow some other items. The least number of possible sequences belong to phonetic items because their number is relatively small and they depend on the order of introducing words, and different types of word order are sequenced. In lexical sequencing, concrete nouns, abstract nouns, verbs, and modifiers are sequenced. But it is not the same for all of them. So in semantic sequencing, structural meanings and lexical meanings are sequenced since both the structure and the vocabulary of a language have meaning. So structural meanings are related to structure, words, inflectional forms, and typical of word order. More on sequencing, and grading. Some form of grading is a universal requirement in language teaching from Allen 1984, cited in White 1988. However, the emphasis put on gradation and sequencing differs based on the different syllabus. For example, in the linear format, issues of sequencing and grading of the content are of paramount importance. Linguistic and pedagogical principles determine the order of item presentation, which are particularly grammar or structure. First, the sequence is determined when internal grading of each unit and among units follows, while in the cyclical format, the organizational principles is working with the same topic over time, but a more complex or difficult level. This goes with the recycling principle of sequencing. So Darwin and Olstein, 1986. It should be also noted that even principles used in sequencing content with a course differ. For example, in grammar-based courses, gradation and selection is based on difficulty of items or their frequency, whereas in communicative courses, sequencing can be determined by learners' communicative needs, according to Richards and Rogers on the year 2001. Moreover, it should be mentioned that there are even objections to principles of sequencing. Going from familiar to unfamiliar, another traditional principle of sequencing is challenged by the idea that children are interested in the exotic and unfamiliar. One, the third, it seems, therefore, that language-centered syllabuses cannot satisfactorily establish what is easy to that of difficult or useful for learners. And difficult for a learner A might not be difficult for learner B. That's true, since some factors depend on the characteristics of the learner. Thus, selection, gradation, and sequencing of the units of progression should also consider psychological criteria and evidence from students' needs in a learner-centered curriculum. And here we are, learner-centered syllabuses. So throughout the 20th century, there was a movement away from mastery-oriented approaches, focusing on the production of accurate examples of language use, to the use of more activity-oriented approaches, focusing on interactive and communicative classroom processes. As mentioned by Richards on the year 2001, methods are deeply rooted in a syllabus or content selection. Three more methods could be categorized under one of the two headings. Language-centered methods composed of those methods which are based on a theory of the nature of human. The language and learner-centered methods which are based on a theory of the learning process. And content selection of learner-centered materials. So just as mentioned above, language-centered methods adhere to the synthetic approach to syllabus design, in which the content of learning and teaching is defined in terms of discrete items of grammatical and lexical forms of the language that are presented to the learners. In other words, linguistic forms constitute the organizing principle for syllabus construction. Next is drawing from the available inventory of linguistic forms complied by grammarians through standard linguistic analysis. The syllabus designer selects and sequences the phonological, lexical, and grammatical elements of the language that can be induced in graded textbooks used for classroom teaching. However, learner-centered syllabuses follow analytic approaches to syllabus designing, in which, according to White 1988, both teachers and learners are joint decision makers on the content selection and gradation. Noonan, on the year 1997, held that learner-centered syllabuses focus on the collaboration between the teacher and the learners, which in turn get students involved in making the decisions on the content. And of course, selection and gradation, it is therefore the selected content is not clearly decisive at the onset of the course, but will be redefined as learners involved in different kinds of learning activities and teachers gain more evidence regarding the learner's needs. So the selection of content is shaped and refined rather than being completely predetermined. So while developing materials, not only is determining the types of tasks to be included in the course books essential, but also following some general guidelines which may facilitate learning is compulsory. So these guidelines are suggested by Tomlinson 2008 have to be included in ELT course books and materials to assist language learning as follows: provide rich experience with varying genres and text types, provide a aesthetically positive experience through graphical design, use of multimedia for rich and varied language learning, help learners make discoveries for themselves, help learners become autonomous language learners, provide supplementary materials for extensive listening and reading, and help learners personalize and localize their language learning. Now let's have the grading and sequencing. So developing materials through a learner-centered approach calls for incorporating pedagogic tasks into the content on one hand and grading this task, centering learners on the other. However, Noon in 1997 believes grading content which is totally in the form of pedagogic tasks is complex and relies on various factors. The degree to which the language event is embedded in the context which facilitates comprehension. Another is the degree to which the language event makes cognitive demands on the learner. The degree to which the background knowledge of the language user can be utilized to assist in comprehension. Next is the amount of assistance provided to the language learner, then the processing difficulty of the language, and the degree of stress experienced by the learner in taking part of the event. Furthermore, currently on the year 1984 points to the interaction of the three factors of learner, task, and text in determining task difficulty. He suggests the following factors to be considered in grading objectives. First, learner factors including confidence, motivation, prior learning experience, learning pace, observability in language skills, cultural knowledge or awareness, and linguistic knowledge. Next is task factors, namely relevance, complexity, amount of context provided prior to task, processability of language of the task, amount of help available to the learner, degree of grammatical accuracy, contextual appropriateness, and time available. And text factors, like including size and density of the text, presentation, and text. So there are various classifications of grading factors by different scholars who almost highlighted the above-mentioned factors. And these criteria are the ones which can particularly guide materials designers to sequence tasks. What are those? First, since the act of sequencing in a learner-centered syllabuses is complex, as according to Kerbel 1985, proposed an action sequence approach which has 4 steps. First, identifying the learner's areas of interest and need in broad thematic terms. Second, identifying the series of communication situations related to that theme and link them to form an action sequence. Third, selecting or devising materials appropriate to the situations in the action sequence. And fourth, choosing language points to focus on from the materials. However, Robinson in Press has completely taken different view on the criteria of grading pedagogic tasks. He believes that tasks can impose various demands on the learners in keeping with their structures or require special amount of information processes. This is considered as cognitive task complexity. In his cognition hypothesis, Robinson in Press also points out to some dimensions of task complexity to be passively influential in language performance and learning, namely planning time, single or dual task, intentional reasoning, spatial reasoning. So here it is, planning time, second, dual or async or dual task, third, intentional reasoning, fourth, spatial reasoning, and fifth, here and now, or there and then. Any language teaching and learning program calls for materials which comprise an appropriate content. Selecting such a content, the ELT material developers should design upon the units of professions throughout the whole material. The units of progression for selection and grading of items in materials rising out of language-centered syllabuses are carried out on a grammatical basis, which fell into disfavor because they failed adequately to take psycholinguistic principles into account. Therefore, there was a shift of focus from language-centered approaches to learner-centered ones. Once consideration of learning process is built into the syllabus, the faded discrepancy between syllabus design and methodology gives rise to the emergence of a learner-centered approach in communicative language teaching, which in turn leads to the task-based content selection and gradation while developing materials. Hence, valuing a learner-centered approach, learners' needs turn out to be the primary focus of material developers. Okay, so although by considering different factors in selecting grading and sequencing, the content materials developers, specifically EL book writers, try to take into account several factors to facilitate language learning. It is worth mentioning that there are several obstacles for writers, as pointed out by Tomlinson on the year 2000 and 2008, which constrain them. He also believes that materials writers are confronted with a number of competing demands. They have to make their materials suitable for a wide variety of teachers with different amounts of experience and more or less qualifications, and with different teaching styles and beliefs. All right. So I hope you learn or gain something regarding the selection and gradation of materials, so steps by steps. So for your test, okay, so complete the chart below. Your upon reading the selection, or go back to the discussion about this. So let us check your understanding by completing the charts as shown with entries code 4. So that is. So for references, alright, so this self-read course book. Thank you so much from Miss Mom, Isabella. Okay, and of course another references. Alright, so I hope that you learned a lot, and until next meeting, thank you so much for watching.